So many thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here. I'm going to be talking on the topic of user-centered design of search applications. So I mean, I'd like to keep it interactive. I'll try and keep my eye on the chat, but I recognize that that might be a little bit difficult. But please do feel free to interrupt me. We can turn this into more of a conversation than a monologue. So just a little bit about my background. I kind of work at the intersection of information retrieval and natural language processing and user experience, and I have done really for probably more years than I should really disclose. I won't give you the whole life story. I was originally an academic, but then I found my way into industry, sort of into industrial R&D, basically, for large organizations, but occasionally with startups and a little bit of third sector work as well. So I worked in a lot of different environments, and you can see from my bio there, I kind of wear a number of different hats, but they all sort of revolve around information retrieval or user experience or natural language processing, and usually 2 out of those 3 at any one time. So that's my background, and what we're going to be covering today is I'm going to give you a little bit of a taster. One of the things, obviously, I have an academic hat, and I teach a variety of modules actually around sort of user experience and interaction design. And a lot of my research, as I mentioned, is around information retrieval. So I do training courses that are sort of at CPD level, and you can see some examples of them here. By that I mean continuing professional development rather than academic. So what I'm doing for this little slot really is just giving you a little bit of a taste of that. Here's an agenda from one of those courses, and it very much follows the pattern of the book that I co-wrote with Tyler Tate a few years ago called Designing the Search Experience. And one of the things about that book is that after a while of working on search problems, you realize that they do start to repeat. You do see what are known as patterns, and we can implement what are called design patterns, which are principled solutions to these common problems. But you don't have to wait very long within the information retrieval industry to come across a problem that you've not solved before, or maybe nobody's solved before. So that's why it's important, I think, and this is one thing we do in the book and I do in the training courses, is to try and ground people, participants, in the sort of principles of human information seeking behavior and how they relate to best practice in user experience design. So that's kind of what you're seeing on the screen now. Is that, I'm not sure why my mouse keeps flipping to the previous slide, but I'll perhaps not touch the mouse and use the keys instead. But that's what we're seeing here. Is there's the second part of the course is really about what we call the design patterns, the common solutions to, or principal solutions to common problems, and the first part is really the fundamental concepts and principles of information seeking behavior. So that's kind of what I'm going to give her a flavor of in the next 30-40 minutes or so. And what I also want to try and do is related to the excellent previous talks that we've had. As I say, as Martin introduced, obviously he talked on machine learning and AI a couple of weeks ago, and Ingo talked about evaluation, was that 2 weeks ago. So I'll try throughout the course of the next half hour or so to point back to provide the connections between these various elements of the search experience. So to kick us off, let's just set the scene a little bit by just kind of reminding ourselves what we mean by search. And I think everybody on this call has a reasonably mature and nuanced understanding of what we mean by information retrieval, but that's not exclusively so. A lot of people who come into it are new, and perhaps certainly a lot of people that go to a certain conference have a very web-centric view of information retrieval. So I think it's useful just to remind ourselves that web search is very important, clearly, but it's not the only show in town. So that's what this slide is illustrating here, is that we can think of web search as being essentially, self-service. You've got multiple interfaces to it, or multiple search engines. You're searching essentially a single source, anything that's at the end of a URL, and it's essentially uncurated. And that contrasts with professional search, which in some ways was, where we all started back in that, well, some of us in the 50s and 60s before the web came along, with professional search, which obviously is through as an intermediary, arguably with a single interface and multiple sources and curated content and so on. So those are two quite contrasting contexts for search, and in the work that I do around designing search experiences, I think it's important to understand that context, the differences in that context and the nuances that brings. And also, of course, those aren't the only two. There's the site search. Anybody who's ever bought anything online knows the importance of effective search in an e-commerce environment. And of course, enterprise search, one of the trickiest search problems there are for all sorts of reasons, and under-researched in many ways. So they all bring their own challenges, and you can use this little framework over here on the left to try and think, well, okay, what would site search be? Is that self-service? Is that multiple interfaces? So this little sort of framework on the left that you see is a good way of, I find anyway, of looking at the different contexts. So that kind of leads us to this search word, and I think the title of my talk is User Centered Design of Search Applications. But again, part of the scene setting really is just to rethink what we mean by that term search. And again, it had a very narrow meaning, I think, for many years, and part of my job in trying to get people to understand the importance of designing search experience was getting them to understand that search was more than just a box and 10 blue links on a page, and that it was more than just keyword search for all the reasons that we can see here. And that really we should be thinking about search as, yeah, okay, information retrieval is an important part, but that's just part of a much larger cycle of problem solving in information rich environments, which involves analysis of the results that we get back and the other associated content that we may have consumed through other information oriented activities of browsing, navigation, and so on. And then the sense making that goes with that can lead to then other episodes and other inquiries that drive future, subsequent information retrieval activities. And again, to point back to the previous talk, and I think a couple of us have actually used this infographic here on the left. I think Ingo used it in particular. It's I hope whoever drew it wasn't on the call. I find it one of the most whimsical infographics I've ever seen from a visual design point of view, but actually it communicates its point reasonably well. And in fact, we slightly simplified it with the graphic you see on the right for the book, but they're basically conveying the same idea, that information retrieval exists within a broader context of information seeking. And you need to think about that within the broader context of, nobody goes into work thinking, okay, I'm going to do some information seeking today. It's within the context of some bigger decision making or diagnosis task or understanding or exploration task. And that, of course, takes place within another environment, with a whole set of cultural constraints associated with it. So whichever version you pick, I think these two diagrams do convey the bigger picture really around the notion of information retrieval and search and how it fits within a broader context. And if you take a moment to look at the infographic on the left, it also quite neatly conveys the different metrics that you might look at with the A, B, C, and D down the bottom. Oh, I believe somebody's ringing. Anyway, I hope somebody else will pick up that call. So yeah, so I would encourage you to have a little look at that graphic over there on the left. So I will move on. And another thing I would point back to is the talk that Ingo gave 2 weeks ago, which I found really, really fascinating, and I learned a lot from that. So I'm only going to have one slide on it, but again, it's a very important thing. Ingo talked about evaluation in information retrieval. And as I said, gave a very comprehensive account of that discipline. I'm only going to do one slide of it precisely because Ingo covered it so well, but I do think I shouldn't overlook it, because I think one of the most important issues in designing effective search experiences is actually deciding what success looks like, and being able to put some numbers around that right from the outset, and getting clients or participants, whatever they are, students, whatever they are, to be able to think constructively and quantitatively about what a good search experience might look like. So they have some sense of progress towards that end goal that they're aiming for. So again, as I said, I'm only going to put one slide here. This is most of us, I think, are familiar with precision and recall. And that little quote down there, on the bottom right, really summarizes it, that we're looking for the truth in our results, i.e. relevance, and we're looking for good recall, which is the whole truth, and good precision, which is nothing but the truth. So, so as I said, Ingo really gave an excellent account of this a couple of weeks ago, so I'm not going to talk any more about evaluation now, but just suffice it to say that it's really important, I think, at the start of any design project to have a good sense of what success actually looks like. So I'm going to move on to talk a little bit about models of the information seeking process here, and how they can be used to support a principled approach to search experience design. And there's actually several models from the history of IR that I think are useful, but I'm just going to call out a few here. You're probably familiar with the classic model. Goes back to 1977 and Steve Robertson, and you can see here, on the left, you've got an information need, which gives rise to a query. And over on the right, we've got our document collection, which is represented in some way, and then a match takes place in the middle. And that's one way of understanding the process. But of course, there's no user in this. And that's what we're here really to talk about today, is the user-centric way of thinking about search. So let's move in on talk about another model. Here's, I'm not quite sure what it's called, a standard model, but there you go. This one dates from 1998. So it has a slightly more transparent representation or indirect representation of the user here through a task, which gives rise to an information need, which is verbalized as a query. And then you get your search engine with the document collection, and you got your results, and then a process of query refinement, which returns back to the query, and you've got a loop there. And again, this is a very valuable way of characterizing the search process, but in my view, it kind of has two very significant shortcomings that are particularly relevant when we start to think more about designing for users. And that really leads us to the third model, which is called the dynamic model, or sometimes called the berry picking model. And this one was popularized by Marsha Bates. And you'll notice a couple of things about it straight away, which is that it's non-linear. So one of the things that you will rapidly discover or observe if you ever run usability sessions or user studies on information seeking behavior is it's very hard to predict the direction of travel. And it's the search process itself is very much non-linear, which is captured here in this infographic. And the other thing is that it's not so much about trying to find the perfect set of documents as the measure of success, but more the accretion of insights and observations that are made along the way, which is kind of alluded to by these little points you see with the documents here and different questions. So non-linear and an accumulation of insights along the way, which I think characterize the search process very well. So those are three models really that I think are very valuable in understanding the sort of findability problem of how to get users from a standing start to an information resource. And then there's another model which I find very useful in terms of trying to understand what people do when they found that resource. And this is sometimes referred to as information foraging. And this actually has its origins in, I guess, biological or zoological research dating from the 60s, where people looked at animal behavior when they forage in a certain area, and how long they choose to spend in that area before they move on to another area. And as you might imagine, and every time I touch the mouse, it does a strange thing. But we see this curve here, where there's a law of diminishing returns, where an animal will arrive at a patch and consume as much as it can, as rapidly as it can, but gradually those resources are diminished over time. And so we see a curve here that the resource intake starts steeply, but then converges towards an asymptote, and as the time foraging in the patch increases. But there's also a transit time between different patches, and it turns out that you can work out the optimal time in a patch by taking a tangent from the transit time between patches to that curve, and where those two intersect is the optimal time for foraging in a patch. And it turns out that this model is remarkably predictive of animal behavior. And remarkably effective in explaining, the observed behaviours that we see in nature. And it's also remarkably useful for understanding information foraging, because it's the same notion, is that a user arrives at a certain point or at a certain resource, and then will consume the information available at that resource. And the amount of time that they stay is basically a cost-benefit analysis between staying and traveling, and the amount of time they stay is proportional to the transit time. So at one extreme, you might think about e-commerce sites, where essentially a competitor is just a click away. So perhaps not surprisingly, the time that people spend on e-commerce sites, is proportionally diminished, because if they don't find out what they want on one site, they can easily click away and go to another site. And you can imagine at another extreme, you might find very specialist databases where, even though the search experience might be awful, people will spend a lot of time on them, precisely because the cost of switching to another database is so expensive. So that's another really useful model, I think, of understanding and being able to predict behavior of your users when consuming information resources. And just a final couple of models, really, before I'm going to sort of switch to gears slightly and talk a little bit more about the design process. Here's a little bit, I call this a sketch. It's not really a model, but this actually dates back to my days at Endeca, which, as you may imagine, was one of the original pioneers of faceted search, subsequently bought out by Oracle. And this was how we used to characterize the long-term information goal. You can see it's a sketch of the process, but it's got some interesting insights in it, and some interesting loops and a nice little narration. So it's a convenient little storyboard that we often used to use for helping underpin the design process. And it actually resonates with more academic work. Carol Coulthow's work, a couple of decades old now, but it's still, very valuable, which talks about how people satisfy long-term information goals, and shows again a sort of funnel here, but going through various stages from initiation and selection all the way through to collection. So just to kind of round out this section, I think where that leaves us is that these models are incredibly valuable, and I think that they're not traditionally taught within UX courses and not traditionally taught as part of interaction design courses, but they're as I said, very highly valuable in understanding human information seeking behavior, and they're, I think, part of the toolkit that I think we bring to bear when we're designing search experiences. And where that leads us is that it's very useful to think about the search process as supporting 3 stages. So to use a chess analogy, we've got a kind of opening game, which is where the query formulation takes place. And then we've got what we call a middle game, which is where the refinement and disambiguation takes place. And we've got an end game, which is where the payload or target content is consumed. And each of these presents its own challenges. And actually, I find this little framework is really valuable in terms of designing search experiences, because it helps people who aren't used to it or are new to this discipline understand where the various design artifacts might be brought to bear to greatest value with it, and helping them understand that process, that it's not just, you know, a search page, do a wireframe for a search page and you're done. It's a much more complex process than that. And there's a whole set of best practices around the opening game, the query formulation. The middle game can be huge. That is where, to coin a phrase, that's where the heavy lifting takes place. And there's also, for faceted search in particular, there's a lot of subtlety, a lot of depth, a lot of nuance to getting that middle game right. You might argue that the end game isn't that just the delivery of the content pages or the, you know, the whatever the target content is, and to a degree that's true. But you know, in an e-commerce environment, there'll be all sorts of merchandising, all sorts of sideways paths, all sorts of other routes, all sorts of associated things that you might want to present to the user. And even in media and publishing, again, stickiness is so important. So a lot of things can happen on that end game to trigger new inquiries and to trigger new information seeking episodes that again lead to good search experiences. So it's not just although we call it the end game, it very rarely is the end. It's merely a stepping point to another interaction. Okay, so that's kind of like a really quick trip through some of the sort of concepts and principles behind human information seeking. I'm going to segue briefly now to talk a little bit about design, and if there's some time left, I might talk very briefly. So just to get us all thinking about the sort of problem space here, a really common question, you know, when people are designing search experiences, they pay for some search tool, or they've built an app and they need to put a search function on it. And if it's of any complexity, it's probably going to be faceted of some sort. So a first question, you know, sort of beginner's question is, well, what are we going to do with this faceted navigation? Where are we going to put it and how do we organize it? And you know, might say, oh, well, you know, it's on the left and it's going to be vertical. That's a no-brainer. But kind of not really, because there's lots of other ways you can do it, and particularly in a mobile or tablet or smartphone environment, you know, you need to think a little bit more broadly about the best way to deploy that. And even on a desktop environment, you know, there's arguments for all sorts of other configurations and arrangements. So yeah, the answer to that can be quite nuanced. And similarly, if you've got mixed content, and by that I mean like highly heterogeneous results, so typically a library will have this issue, but lots of other media publishing, sometimes e-commerce, definitely in enterprise search. So you've got all sorts of different things that you're going to return. It might be people's profiles, it might be web pages, it might be research articles, it might be books, it might be CDs if they still exist, it might be videos, it might be podcasts. It's all mixed content, right? So one answer to this question is, I'll just shove it all on the page and let the user figure it out, which isn't really a very good answer. So you probably want to use something a little bit more sophisticated. So for example, you might say, oh, we'll use some sort of iconography, you know, we'll use little I don't know if you can see on this screen, but there's a little book icon for a book, and there's a little different icon for an ebook, and so on. So you can use iconography, or you could have different containers. So we've got these tabbed containers over here on the right, so that, you know, does some of the work for the user in doing that categorization, and then they can dip into those various tabs to find what they want. So the answer to this question and the previous one, as you probably realized, is, well, it kind of depends. Yeah, there is no right answer. So that is true, but it really begs the question, well, what does it depend on? And the answer to that is a little bit more nuanced, because at a simplistic level, well, perhaps not even simplistic, at a kind of textbook level, you could fall back on best practice in human factors and you know, human computer interaction design, and say, well, when you're designing any solution, you need to think about the, you know, who the user is, what they're trying to do, and the context. Okay, so, and this is true here. We need to think about our user type. We need to think about their goal or their objective. and we need to think about their context. So those first three things are common really throughout any user-centered design approach or any user-centered design philosophy. But because this is search, and because we're talking about problem solving in information-rich environments, in the work that I've done with various other colleagues, academic and non-academic, we've added a fourth dimension, which captures the kind of how. So if the first three are the who, the what, and the where, the fourth one is the how. How are they doing it? So let me just briefly talk you through those, and then I'll segue a little bit in what time we have into design models and design processes. So the first of those was our user type, and there's lots of different ways of categorizing different users, and this slide only captures a kind of very superficial understanding of that. But one dimension is their expertise. You might have a tech enthusiast at one end who's expert and confident, and a novice shopper at the other who's uncertain. And each of them will have different needs. And one of the things that I think is very important designing search experiences is figuring out where are your users, or how are you going to categorize your users, and where do they sit on this spectrum? And more importantly, what's the priority among them? And that's always a very interesting discussion to have. So that's within the context of e-commerce, but the same with that news site that I showed you earlier, the one with the horizontal faceted navigation. You might find you got professional users at one end who are expert and confident, or you might find, you know, casual subscribers or casual users at the other end whom you might want to convert into subscribers who are novice and uncertain novices. And again, same question, you know, who are your users? How are you categorizing them? Where do they sit on this spectrum, and what's the priority? So moving on to that second dimension, what are they trying to do? You now know who they are. Let's call it electronics engineer. What are they trying to do? So they might be doing something that's very focused and simple, you know, a fact-finding known item search, or they might be doing something a little bit more complex, like a constraint satisfaction problem. Or they might have something that's very, very high level, much more abstract and much more broad and complex. And the same, you can get us, you can look at the same dimension within an e-commerce context, that you've got sort of really simplistic, well, relatively simplistic known item search at one end, middling sort of constraint satisfaction, information seeking challenges in the middle, and then much more abstract, higher level, but arguably higher value goals over on the right hand side that are much more broad and complex. And the same, we apply the same rigor here. We say, okay, we think we know who our users are now. What are they trying to do? What kind of things are they going to do, and where would they sit on this spectrum? And then the third dimension is context, and you saw on the previous slide, there's also, you know, spatio-temporal context, organizational context. Context is a multifaceted thing in its own right. I'm only showing one of those facets, which is the information assets that you're searching, which could be simple and homogeneous at one end, or highly faceted and diverse at the other. And then we've got all sorts of variations in between, and perhaps associated user-generated content and social media accompanying it as well. So that's just one aspect of the context. And then the fourth dimension of the search experience is what we've referred to as the search mode, which is the kind of how the user is going about their information seeking task. And there is a significant body of academic work here dating back to Ellis's work 1993 and probably before that. You see these characterizations of search behavior here, chaining, browsing, differentiating, and Marcianini's very influential work from 2006 illustrated in that graphic over there, top right, and practitioner work as well. You know, this isn't exclusively an academic phenomenon. Peter Morville's excellent work, Search Patterns, from 2010, shows a different set of tasks, a different set of behaviors there that he's identified as repeating in information seeking. And you know, the work that I've done, again with data based on several engagements, professional services engagements in Endeca, we analysed the data that we had there. Yeah, I was just saying that
this work here there's a significant body of academic work here and also practitioner work. And then the work that I've done with academic colleagues, we've introduced a taxonomy which kind of builds on Gary Marcianini's taxonomy, with the 3 categories that you see here, but with a slightly different set of modes. And there's some interesting, as I said, academic publications that we've produced based on this work. So for the last bit of this talk, I'm going to segue into just talking a little bit more sort of directly about design as a thing, as a discipline, and as a practice in its own right. Now, most of us are familiar with what used to be called interface design, okay? And we're probably also familiar with visual design, i.e. color palettes, the visceral, the skin, the color, the typography, the fonts, and so on. What we may not all be familiar with is other aspects of design, such as information architecture, which is the structuring of information spaces to support navigation and findability, and interaction design, which is kind of the sort of modern equivalent of what used to be called interface design, i.e. designing interactive products and services. These are all separate skills in their own right. You know, okay, in a startup, you might have one person doing everything, but in a more mature, established, you know, corporate environment with a reasonably mature UX function, these could well be carried out. I would expect these to be carried out by different people. So they're different skills and different competencies. And of course, it should all be backed up by a solid evidence base, which is gathered through user research. And then that should align with a design methodology. We're obviously talking about user-centered design here today, but there's various sort of perspectives within that. And then that fits within a product management or product development process, agile or some other flavor of that typically. Just while we're continuing to think about models, I want to introduce this one to you as well, which is, this one's really stood the test of time. This is an infographic that dates, actually it's about 3 decades now. I know 2 decades, not quite that long. This is from Jesse James Garrett's work from 2000, and it really has stood the test of time. I won't try and read every word, but I just want to draw your attention to the fact that he has very astutely identified several levels to user experience, from the visual design at the top to the kind of user needs and site objectives at the bottom. And he's also very, you know, astutely observed that there are 2 aspects to, well, at least thinking about the web, but it's not just the web. I think there are other platforms as well to which this applies, where you've got web as a software interface on the left, where we're talking about interaction design and functional specs, and the web as a hypertext system on the right, where we're thinking about information architecture and content requirements. But all of these things fit together to create this kind of multi-layered understanding of user experience. And again, back as I said on the previous slide, there are often different skills and different competencies that are associated with each of these levels and the 2 halves of the diagram. And there's actually a standard for user-centered design as well. Although I know that, you know, there are lots of different schools of thought around design and the degree to which it should be a, you know, purely creative process. But if we want to adopt a principled and repeatable and reproducible approach to design, then it's probably good to start with an established methodology or established approach. And there is a standard, as I said, for that, ISO 9241 Part 210, which is illustrated here. Again, it's cyclical in nature. We specify the context of use, specify the requirements, produce the design solutions, and then evaluate them. And another useful model for thinking about the user-centered design process is this one, which is called the double diamond approach. And this owes its origins in Design Council. And there's a lot of stuff on here. I'm not going to attempt to read every word, but I would draw your attention to a couple of things. Look at the phases across the bottom. you've got the definition of a concrete strategy with discovery and defining the problem. So it recognizes that the most important thing is to solve the right problem before you even start developing design ideas and delivering the solution. So you can think of on the left is, are we solving the right problem? And then on the right is, are we solving the problem right? Okay, and you can see that another really useful insight in this, the reason it's diamond shaped is because the discovery phase is what we have divergent thinking, where we're broadening our outlook. And then as you go through the next stage of defining the problem, you have convergent thinking, converging on a common solution and common understanding of the problem space. And then you segue into design exploration, which by its very nature, again, is divergent thinking. And as you iterate towards a solution or set of solutions, then you get the convergent thinking, back to the pointer on the right. And this slide's also very useful because we've got labeled on it all sorts of different user experience activities and deliverables and interventions that would be appropriate at those stages in the design process. But as I said, there's lots of others. I'm a great fan of the double diamond process. But as I said, it's not the only one. There's the Stanford D-School design thinking process. Some of these elements, of course, overlap with the ones that we just saw on the previous slide, but it's slightly more non-linear, I guess. At least that's one of the key principles that it conveys. But again, you've got the same idea of emphasizing defining the problem and ideation of design exploration and prototyping and testing. And you can see the little annotations there that tell a little bit more about the activities at each stage. And then there's Google Design Sprints. These are a relatively recent phenomenon. Again, the kind of principles are the same as what we've just talked about, where you've got sort of understanding or discovery phase, divergent phase, a phase where you develop lots of solutions, a decision-making phase where you're perhaps converging on solutions, then prototyping and validation. So it's a variation on the ideas that we've already seen. I think what makes Google Design Sprints interesting, though, is the notion that you time box them into a week and that you bring all the stakeholders there physically together in a room, and that the sprint is a very immersive activity that takes place over 5 days. And you can see the subscripts there, days 1 to 5, that articulate that. So that's probably it, really, for bringing the my sort of views on design to a close. I think really I'll just wrap up just by giving you some conclusions. I don't know how hard we are on time, Martin. Should I stop at 19:45 on the dot? Sorry, 19:15 on the dot. What do you think?
No, round it out, Tony.
Oh, I've got a little bit of flex, have I? Well, I'll take 2 minutes then.
That's fine.
To talk about one other aspect of where I focus my research these days, which is around the notion of professional search and advanced search. And I'll summarize this very briefly. We've all had that experience where we've used an advanced search form, and generally speaking, it's a pretty frustrating and unproductive experience for all sorts of reasons. And we're probably most of us familiar with these kind of search UIs that encourage us to articulate Boolean expressions and then string them together in a sort of form-based manner. They can lead to, those of us among us who are professional searchers are probably familiar with this kind of thing, which is typically the output of those interfaces, and it's a search strategy. And for those who aren't familiar with this, you can see that it's a collection of controlled vocabulary terms, it's a collection of Boolean expressions, and they're all linked together with the line numbers. You see that line number 33 is telling us to take line number 32 and to knot it with line number 31, and line number 32 is telling us to take 10 and 17 and 22. Anyway, you can work backwards. What I would encourage you to do is to try and work out in your head to try and visualize it. And I'm not saying try and visualize the whole thing, just try and count the number of blocks, right? Just work backwards from the top down and see if you can figure out how many blocks. It's tricky, is the answer. I've asked this this question on several occasions, and the combined number of people I've asked it to probably goes into the hundreds, and only one person's ever got it right. So see if you can be the second person that gets it right. How many blocks are in that search strategy? How many conceptual groups? Anyway, I've only got a couple of minutes. So where I'm going with this thought is that Boolean strings are flawed. They don't scale well, they're inefficient, and they're poor at communicating structure. And there's been all sorts of audits that have taken place that have demonstrated this, that in my view, at least, they're not fit for purpose, and it's time to think about other things. And that really segues into the research that I've done over the past couple of years with academic colleagues, Farid Shakrani, Andy McFarlane, John Chamberlain, and many others who've contributed to this and thought about, well, can we reinvent advanced search? And again, we're standing on the shoulders of giants. There's various others that have gone before. You know, I'm summarizing 30 years of research in 2 slides here for you, but there is a longer literature review in some of the papers. And so the question is, how could we visualize search strategies? Maybe a tree approach is the right way to go, as you see over here on the right, which is what Search Refiner does, or maybe a grid, which is, this is David Newman's Excel spreadsheet approach. So the work that we've done, we've produced an app where you visualize search strategies on a canvas. You can either build them from scratch, or you can, parse an existing query string and it'll build it on the canvas. And straight away that conveys some advantages, that you don't have to worry about dropping brackets anymore. You only create syntactically correct expressions. Arguably, the semantics is more transparent because you can just see on the canvas what the search strategy looks like, and you can zoom in and out, and you can, it's just a much more playful interaction where you can try what if scenarios and benefit from all sorts of tools that you would associate with a software development environment that haven't yet been invented in search development environments, but in my opinion should be. And the tool allows you to interrogate 12 different databases and provides automated translations for a whole bunch of other ones, and does some error checking and lots of other bits and pieces too. But in the interest of time, I'm just going to round this out by doing the sort of big reveal. If anybody wants to put a number in the chat of how many conceptual blocks there was in that search strategy, now is your last chance, because I'm about to show it to you. If you read it in with the tool, it would look like this. And it's kind of like fairly obvious that there are 4 conceptual groups, the labels I've added, but you can see that there's a type of study group, a target population, an intervention, and a bunch of exclusions. If you read the search strategy closely enough, you might have worked all that out, but it's hard work, to be honest. And it's much easier when, in my opinion at least, just to see it on the page like this. So that really brings us to the conclusion then, and we're pretty much on time. So just to kind of round out the points, I'm very much in favor of adopting a principled approach to design. So, all the things we talked about, knowing your users, their goals, their context, and also what search modes you expect or want to support in your application. Look at search holistically. As I said, there's lots of different search contexts, each have their own nuances and challenges, but you can borrow ideas from one and apply them to another. It's more than just findability. The talk is, the series is talked about information retrieval, but of course, I think we all mean that in a more holistic sense, thinking about information seeking. And that incorporates analysis and sense making. And of course, study other search applications. There's lots of other good work out there, and there's no dishonor, I think, in taking good examples and good design patterns, and there are even design pattern libraries out there which can provide you ready-made solutions to common problems. And of course, take advantage of online resources, and exactly as I just said, there are lots of design patterns and books out there. So that's really it from me. So please do keep in touch. I'm sort of more than happy to answer any questions that we have in the time remaining, and always happy to engage in discussion. And if anybody wants to follow up on anything that they've seen today, more than happy to do that. And in the back of the slide deck, I've also included a load of other resources around search user experience, which I probably won't sort of linger on them too much now. But you can see them there. They're in the back of the slide deck. But I will leave you with just that slide there and hand back to Martin.